see if this works. So, what if I did not want to work? Okay, are people going to show up now?
Maybe if I randomly play Alto Clarinet, they'll show up.
Okay. Go to the others.
If I start playing, I feel like someone might show up. Someone's watching.
All right. Yeah. For some reason, I'm having problems with the Wi-Fi, so just leave something in the chat if you can see and hear the feed correctly, because I don't know what the heck's going on. My Wi-Fi just nothing's loading on my. Okay. All right. So sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. I guess my Wi-Fi is having problems. So, yeah, as Brendan pointed out, Halstead originally didn't want to put a alto clarinet part in the second suite, but just thinking about it from a publisher's perspective, it seems that publishers were more likely to include an alto clarinet with their music, let's say like 50 years ago, but in pieces that are published recently, it's very rare to see an alto clarinet part. And as I was saying, it's kind of a shame because this is a very useful instrument and has a lot going for it. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of start talking about alto clarinet from a technical point of view. So actually I have 3 alto clarinets here that I got to show off. So this is my, oh yeah, you know, that makes sense.
I was thinking that, but.
Okay, so anyway, let me talk about the alto clarinet from a technical or from a mechanical, acoustical point of view. So I have 3 alto clarinets here. So this is just my simple Academy model buffet alto clarinet. I think I talked about it. I have here a Yamaha new alto clarinet, and behind me I have an older buffet professional model alto clarinet. And they're instruments that are similar in many ways, but very different acoustically. And it kind of shows that there's been a lack of development mechanically and acoustically regarding the alto clarinet versus other members of the clarinet family. So let's take, for example, your standard bass clarinet. I actually have a pretty old bass clarinet here, but looking at the keywork, there's a lot of things that were missing on the alto clarinet. So for starters, and probably the most important feature I think to have on a low clarinet is the fully automatic double register vent mechanism. So what is that? So if you look at a clarinet, when you're playing in the lower register, you are in the fundamental. But when you want to overblow, you're going to the you're trying to play the upper harmonic. So that's not the word for it. The upper register. No, I forget the word for it. Anyway, so what the purpose of the register vent is essentially you're creating a node here. So by venting a little bit of air to the atmosphere, you're creating a node and you're turning that that 1/4 wavelength of a vibrating air column inside your instrument. You're essentially splitting it in half, and that causes the instrument to jump up into the upper register. And it's not a perfect system because you have one single register vent, but you have all these holes. Essentially, you're using the same register vent for a clarion B that you are for a high C. And that creates a problem because ideally this vent should move with every single note that you're playing in the upper register. So it's kind of a compromise. On a standard B-flat clarinet, it's not so bad. We can get away with having one single register vent. On lower clarinets, however, it starts to become more of a problem. So what bass clarinets and some alto clarinets tend to have is what's known as a fully automatic double register vent mechanism. And essentially what this means is that you have two separate register vents, one for the notes below high E flat and one for the notes above. So you can see when I switch between, when I hold the register vent and I switch between, let's say a D and an E, you can see that this register vent opens and closes. And what that does is you're essentially creating a more ideal, the register vent is now in a more ideal location acoustically to try and play that upper register. So some alto clarinets used to have this feature. For example, older Selmers and older Buffets had this feature a lot, but the newer models of these instruments actually lack this feature. And a lot of that is due to complexity. It's a kind of expensive to try and build a complicated mechanism like this because you have to have a linkage that goes from this key down here all the way up to the top of the instrument. So it's very difficult to align, it's difficult to manufacture, and that's caused some manufacturers to think, well, if we're not making as many alto clarinets now, why should we continue to have this feature on an instrument that's not as popular? So most alto clarinets you can buy today are going to be this system. So this is a single register vent system. So you'll see you have two tone holes still, but this one is only for the throat B flat, because if you try to play a throat B flat with just that key, it kind of works, but it's, actually, I don't know if I can play it. Let's see. I can't even, if I were to disable it, you could kind of play a throat B flat through the register vent, but it's not as clear, so you have to have that extra tone hole. And this is the mechanism that's seen on modern Selmers, modern, well, before they stopped being manufactured, LeBlancs, and even the $15,000 Buffet Prestige alto clarinet has just a simple single register vent. How do you feel about Bundy resonant alto clarinets? So Bundy alto clarinets are kind of interesting. So I actually just recently figured this out. They're based on the original Kahn professional alto clarinets. So they're actually not bad instruments. I think the biggest criticism of them, which is a very valid point, is that they have open tone holes. So you can see these are both professional instruments. It's very common for professional instruments. Pretty much it's standard to have plateau keys. And what a plateau key is, it means it's a covered tone hole. So you don't really have to be as precise as where you put your fingers. But the Bundy does not. It has a few open tone holes. So if you're somebody with smaller hands, that kind of creates a problem. It can be hard to cover those tone holes, and of course that would create leaks, and that just makes it hard to play the instrument. And that's part of the reason why, and it's odd, it feels like a big B-flat clarinet. Yeah, it kind of does. I mean, I kind of have big hands, so I don't mind the Bundy, but I know some people absolutely despise them. And that's part of the reason why the alto clarinet, at least it's one of the theories why the alto clarinet has kind of declined in popularity. A lot of the instruments we saw in the 20th century were these instruments with open holes. And the idea was that, well, they're easier to manufacture if they have open holes, but they're more difficult to play. So the idea was bands would take their worst clarinetists, they would put them on an alto clarinet, and many of these clarinets are not used to covering these large holes and dealing with these large keys, so they would have trouble playing the instrument. And it gave the alto clarinet a reputation for being a difficult instrument to play, and one that did not sound well, that constantly squeaked. And this gets kind of the reputation that the alto clarinet got and kept, and it's kind of pushed its decline into obscurity. My friend Matt has just got a brand new Buffet and somehow worked out a sweet deal with the company. Yeah, I've never tried the new Buffet Prestige alto clarinets. I'm curious how they play though, because I said this alto clarinet has a single register vent, and some of the problems that creates is, like, for example, the Clarion B. You can kind of hear that. It might be hard to hear through the stream, but there's a little bit of a hissing noise through the register vent, and what that tells you is that the register vent is in the wrong location. And as far as I can tell, the register vent is approximately in the same location as it is on this 1958 Buffet alto clarinet. So I'm wondering how they solve that acoustically if it still has the same problem. I can only watch for 5 minutes a day, but who's next to you? So this is my girlfriend Jess. She's here because she's actually playing this Yamaha alto clarinet in our wind ensemble, which is, from what I understand, is very unusual to have a permanent alto clarinet player. But I'm actually kind of excited about that because we actually, how many clarinets do we have? 15 in our band?
We have around 15 normal B-flat clarinets, but for our band, I'm the auxiliary clarinetist, so I play alto clarinet, contra alto occasionally, which is not as common, on contrabass. But I give him the good parts on contrabass, so I mainly stick to alto.
Yes, we've got like 15 B-flat clarinets, 2 bass clarinets, so me and somebody else, and then 1 auxiliary clarinet. So imagine if we just have 16 B-flat clarinets and 2 bass clarinets. It's not a very balanced ensemble. So Jess has volunteered to play the alto clarinet, so that's pretty fun. I can only watch, oh wait, never, I read that. I played it once and it was like butter. Easiest clarinet I've ever played in any size. Interesting. Yeah. So the only Buffet Prestige harmony clarinet I've ever played was a 1193 professional bass clarinet, and I did not like it whatsoever. I feel
not a fan either.
It was very resistant, which I wasn't expecting for such an expensive bass clarinet. But it might have just been that instrument, but I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, so there is some development in alto clarinet, but it just makes me wonder how would that instrument play with 2 register vents? Because going back to register vents, actually I have a pretty good comparison point here. I have 2 Buffet alto clarinets, both made in the 50s. However, the main difference between the 2 of them is that this one has a fully automatic double register vent mechanism, and this one just has a single register vent mechanism. So if I take the same mouthpiece, they actually, I think most of the dimensions of the bore are the same. Most of the dimensions of the bore are the same. The only difference is just the location of the register vent. So let's see how that plays in the upper register. So the B is a lot clearer. There's still a little bit of hissing because it's not quite, again, it's still a compromise, but it's a lot better compromise than a single register vent. So the result is that it's a lot easier to play in the upper register. So it's always better to have 2 register vents than 1. And as far as I know, there's only 1 instrument currently being manufactured. Well, actually, there's 2. There's the that have the double register vents. So the Yamaha, and then there's the Amati, but that's actually a copy of the Yamaha, so I don't know if I would count that. A permanent alto clarinet is quite rare, but having a permanent alto clarinet should bring good name to the alto. Yeah, I figured it's just an instrument that it just needs to be used more. I feel like it just has such a bad reputation that nobody's using it anymore. If there were more alto clarinets being played out there, if people were actually using them, which we're starting to see, I think it'd become a popular instrument again. We're almost starting to see a bit of a resurgence of the alto clarinet, just with private individuals purchasing overstock of old alto clarinets from school inventories that they're just like this one. So for example, this one came from a high school. My other alto clarinet also came from a high school. And that gets me to my next
to college. So.
Yeah, so that brings me to my next point. So private players owning instruments. The really nice thing about the alto clarinet is that it is probably one of the cheapest auxiliary clarinets that you can purchase, especially auxiliary low clarinets. So for example, this professional top of the line in its day Buffet alto clarinet cost me all of $600. The other alto clarinet I have, again, a professional Buffet alto, it was only $700. And compare that to like the price of a R13 from the same era, that would easily cost $12,000, $13,000. So they're a great auxiliary instrument if you already play clarinet, because you already know the fingerings, obviously. But they're a lot cheaper than some auxiliary members of the clarinet family. So there's a really good opportunity for players to take up the instrument by purchasing their own. And with regards to alto clarinets already owned by colleges and high schools, of course, many of these instruments are unfortunately in the state of disrepair, and a lot of schools lack the funds to restore these instruments, unfortunately. But again, this is so this alto clarinet is actually an instrument that was loaned to Jess by the universities. So it's very rare to see a university purchase a new alto clarinet, and yet it's happened. So that's pretty exciting. My school had 2 alto clarinets, but I can only find the bunny and not the con, unfortunately. Well, unfortunately, Con stopped making their own alto clarinets, I believe, in the 40s, I think. And most of their modern alto clarinets, by modern I mean like 1950 to 1970, they're Mahler stencils, and those unfortunately are not great instruments. The old Cons are really good, but unfortunately they only go to low E, which is why some older Bundy alto clarinets only go to low E. I don't know, depending on if it's an older Con, it might actually be a decent instrument if it can be fixed. But yeah, unfortunately, that's kind of the state of a lot of alto clarinets. They sit in a state of disrepair without the funds necessary to fix them.
I like a lot of high schools too own Bundys. My high school did.
I don't think my high school owned an alto clarinet, but we had a really small band program to begin with. So, but a lot of the larger high schools do have old alto clarinets still sitting around. My high school wind ensemble has an alto clarinet. Yeah, that's awesome. So it seems like there are a bunch of dedicated people who want to play the instrument, who want to take it up, and who want to make it popular again. And going along those lines, let's talk about some of the criticisms against the alto clarinet. So probably one of the biggest criticisms I've heard is that the range is covered by both the B flat and the bass clarinet. So the idea is that the upper register of the upper register of the bass clarinet covers the range of the alto, and the lower register of the B flat clarinet covers that range as well. So there's no missing gaps. So they would say there's no reason to have this instrument because we can already play all those notes, but it's not so much the notes that we're missing, it's the tone color.
So see, growing up, I've been in many ensembles. I'm a clarinetist, I study professionally. And a lot of the issues that the conductors had with alto clarinet was the tone. They all think it does not have a good tone whatsoever, and it's just a stigma that goes along with it. I mean, this is a professional alto clarinet, which if you ever have the chance to find one, please play it. It's amazing. It will change your life for alto clarinet. But I've had conductors think that I was playing bass clarinet during solo parts when it was alto clarinet. So it depends. It takes a lot of practice, I will say, but you can definitely change people's minds. But for me, I think tone was the biggest stigma that people had.
Speaking of tone, so we're actually playing a what is it, colonial song?
Oh yes.
So we're playing one of the few songs that actually has a alto clarinet solo. So Jess is going to demonstrate it because I suck at the instrument.
I mean,
well, I don't suck. But
it's not much of a solo as much as I like 3-note pickup. It's a 66. But we're gonna play a little before that. Let's see.
So what you can hear there is that the alto clarinet kind of has its own unique voice. It does sound a little bit like a bass clarinet in the lower register, but it has a much more softer, more gentle tone than the bass clarinet, in my opinion. It's a very unique tone color, and it could be exploited by composers who know what they're doing. I play the alto in my high school wind ensemble. Awesome, yeah. So I'm glad to see there are people taking up the alto clarinet.
Oh, for sure.
What about the basset horn? So I have my basset horn here somewhere. I think, oh, it's over there. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later.
Compared to the alto clarinet.
Yeah, I want to do.
We had a good talk about that.
I did have a video comparing the alto clarinet to the basset horn, but unfortunately I recorded it on my phone, so the difference isn't extremely obvious. But it's very subtle difference, but you can hear it in person. I mean, buffet instead of con. I meant, oh wait. Oh, so your school had an older buffet alto clarinet.
Interesting.
I really like these older buffets. They don't. So both of the instruments. No, this one I got on eBay. That one I got from a music shop online. But they don't show up too often. But they seem to be the instruments that they either sell for not a lot, or they sell for a ridiculous amount. Like I've seen radio model alto clarinets, which is kind of like the professional model, sell for well over $1,500. which I guess that's also a signal that some people are taking up the instrument again, and it's starting to get somewhat of a little,
Like a revival.
yeah, a little revival. My band gets a lot of funding though. You should ask if they can. I guess if you can't find the instrument, if you do find it, yeah, get it overhauled, because that'll be the same level as a lot of modern instruments. And I guess let's do a comparison of the. So let's talk about, let's talk, going along that line, let's talk about some of the development of the alto clarinet just in the last 100 years or so. So surprisingly, I think I was touching on this in the beginning, but surprisingly very little development. So looking at this professional, almost new instrument, I think this was purchased
a year ago.
A year or two
That's
ago.
the only person to touch it.
So, and looking at this instrument, which was purchased in 1958. So let's compare features. So again, this instrument has a fully automatic double register vent mechanism. It's a very nice feature, and that's probably one of my favorite things about this instrument. But looking at stuff that you would see on normal B-flat clarinets, for example, this auxiliary A-flat, E-flat lever. This instrument lacks one, which I believe the professional model of the bass clarinet has one, but the alto clarinet does not. What other features? So again, somebody brought up the extended range. Alto clarinets are one of the few members of the few low clarinets that don't have that weren't manufactured in great numbers with an extended range. As I said, there were manufacturers that made low C alto clarinets, but it was never a standard option or something that was really widely available except for the Hammersmith model. But again, very rare to see those. Let's see, you've got another question. All my school has is 2 Bundys, 2 Olds alto clarinets, both open hull. I was the first to play in over 20 years.
That sounds about right.
The Olds alto clarinets are kind of interesting. So as far as I know, most of the Olds alto clarinets are Vito stencils. And I had a Vito for a while, and it was not, I did not like it. And so there's an interesting situation with, I own 2 bass clarinets. Nice, same. And I have like 20 broken bass clarinets that I have to clean up, that I scrapped the keys for my octocontra, but that's another story. A lot of the student grade alto clarinets aren't really good, unfortunately. So talking about an instrument like the Olds. So again, it's a Vito stencil. And Vitos as a whole aren't terrible instruments. They tend to be large bore instruments with a bore around 18 millimeter. They play okay in the lower register, but the problem is the register vent. And as you can tell, that's starting to become a recurring theme here. They only have 1 register vent, but what's weird, the register vent is a lot smaller than you would see on a lot of other alto clarinets. I believe the one on this one is this buffet is about 3 millimeters, and the Vitos are like 2 millimeters. And what that does is it makes it really hard to play in the upper register. It does make it a bit more in tune, but it makes it harder to play. So you get the situation where you have like a student alto clarinet that's really, really difficult to play in the upper register. And that kind of brings me to my next criticism that the alto clarinet often gets, is that it's really only an instrument that can play in the lower register. And it's more of a bass clarinet, but without all the extra notes. And people see this, they see an instrument that can't really play above B and can't really play below low E, where that's already a note that the bass clarinet can easily cover. So why do we need this instrument? And the unfortunate thing is that just like these professional alto clarinets are missing a lot of features that the other bass clarinets would have, student alto clarinets suffer an even worse problem in that they're missing pretty much every feature that you would expect on a good instrument. So a lot of the student alto clarinets, like again, the Bundy has the open hole problem, the Vito has the problem with the register vent. There really aren't any other student alto clarinets out there. There are other models that are sold by their manufacturers, but those again are just pretty much stencil instruments. So essentially, most of them are Vitos. For example, the Yamaha student alto clarinet is a Vito. Yep. So pretty much, if you want a student alto clarinet, you're going to have to deal with a lot of problems, and that again is building on the poor reputation of the alto clarinet. So what we really need are some good student instruments that high schools and possibly even colleges can purchase that would provide a good instrument for students to play and a pleasant instrument to listen to. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be happening. However, at least we still have these older professional instruments to play, fortunately. So for us private individuals who can afford these, and they're really not, obviously, of course, they're not even as expensive as a lot of professional B-flat clarinets. These are really the only way to go.
I'm sorry, that's horrible. A green case.
The Vito Alto Clarinets came with a green case. Yeah, I actually had like a Vito Alto Clarinet that I bought for parts for like $20 or something. But it came with an ugly blue case. Yeah, they come with weird cases. I don't know why.
It must be something like normal black, apparently.
No. I don't know what, like a lot of the cases you see from like the 50s are just well, like I guess the 50s through the 70s or so, like vintage instruments from around those eras have really weird cases. I don't know why they just don't make black cases. They just look so much more professional. But and I digress. Yeah, I've seen a bass clarinet with a brown case. Yeah,
I think I did that once too.
I Vito bass. Yeah, so it seems common that Vitos come in blue cases. I don't know. It seems like instrument manufacturers are going for a craze. They're like brown and blue and just weird colors.
It makes it more unique, and you can't like mistake it for someone else's case.
Yeah, now everything you buy is just black. Yeah. So what should we do next? Do you want to do some duets? Do you have any good pieces? Actually, somebody mentioned the Basset Horn. So let's talk about the Basset Horn in relation to the Alto Clarinet. I do not. Unfortunately, I probably should have assembled it. So this will be a pretty good comparison because, so like my other Buffet professional alto clarinet, the Basset Horn also has a single register vent. However, since the Basset Horn doesn't seem to have as many problems in the upper register for some reason, it seems to do a lot better. I don't really know why that is, but it works, so I'm not going to mess with it. There's my register. Okay. Well, what do you think?
Someone requested us to do duets. Yes. Bugs Bauer thought duets. I should say I'm a classically trained musician, not jazz musician.
All right, so this is my Buffet Basset Horn, and comparing it to the Alto Clarinet, it is lacking some features. So it kind of looks like it should have an A flat E flat key, but this is actually the low D key. Hello. So because it has a lot of extra pinky keys, there's not a lot of room for the they kind of sacrifice the A flat E flat key in exchange for a low D key, which is kind of unfortunate because it's a nice key to have when you have an extended range. But interestingly enough, so these instruments I believe are made let's see, they were made 9 years apart, and they're very similar in many ways. The key work looks almost identical. With a few exceptions. So, for example, the register vent system. I mentioned on this one it has a single register vent, but it also has this extra tone hole to produce a cleaner and clearer throat B flat. But this instrument just has a single register vent that also makes the B flat just like a standard B flat clarinet would. So that seems to be pretty common on older Basset horns. As much as alto clarinets are lacking innovation, Basset horns from like the 19 probably before like 1990, those instruments are lacking features as well. It wasn't until like the modern Buffet Prestige Basset horn and the newer Selmer models that we started to see more advanced instruments. Bakun makes a Basset clarinet. They do indeed, and I'm curious to try it. Although I imagine it's going to be ungodly expensive.
Okay.
Yeah, they kind of like to do that. They kind of like to make their instruments out of fancy woods, and they play decently, but like, so the one Bakun instrument I had was a protege, and within 5 minutes of getting it, the corks, one of the tenon corks fell off, and this was a pretty much a new instrument. And then they played okay, but I just started having so many mechanical problems that I had to get rid of it, which is unfortunate because it was a pretty decent instrument. So I'm hoping their quality control has gone up, and I think that was probably 3 years ago. But anyways,
That's nice though. I will say the B flats.
yeah, although they're ridiculous prices. Like
for sure.
What is their CG Carbon? I think is like $12,000. Which means they did say they were making a bass clarinet soon. I'd be curious to try that. But anyway, so this is the Basset Horn. So and some interesting things about this. The bell of the alto clarinet and the Basset Horn are actually exactly the same, which is kind of a compromise for the Basset Horn because it means the tone hole in the bell isn't quite in the right location, but it was cheaper to use a bell they already had than to try and make one. So that kind of happened. Other than that, like they do share a lot of parts. So like the ring in the middle joint, the thumb rest, a lot of the keys, they are shared in common. So it kind of seems like they took their alto clarinet and just salvaged parts from it to make their Basset Horn.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing at Brett's comment right now.
What is it?
Vicuna seems like a clarinet call.
That's so true.
But there's a question above that we actually talked about today.
What would happen if someone made a low C alto clarinet? Would a Basset clarinet not be needed anymore? So just because you can make an instrument play the range of another instrument doesn't necessarily mean that first instrument would be useless. For example, this Basset Horn, it can go a note lower than the alto clarinet, but that doesn't necessarily make the alto clarinet a useless instrument. If you made an alto clarinet that went to low C, I think we would still use the Basset clarinet because that's the instrument that the Mozart concerto and the quintet were written for. It all goes back to composers. Most people would agree that you should be trying to use the instrument that the composer wrote for to the best of your ability. Obviously, if you can't get a Basset Horn, using an alto clarinet isn't a bad substitute. A lot of people do it.
However, you will make music historians twitch. So the original's best.
So talking about the Basset Horn, I know Brett Newton likes to say that this is a alto clarinet in F. I don't really, I was going to be mad, but I don't really agree with that. I think what makes the Basset Horn unique is the small bore. It isn't very different, but it is very subtly different, and it changes the acoustics of the instrument. For example, it makes it a lot easier to play in the higher register. When we did Mozart's Grand Partita a few months ago, we used alto clarinets. Yeah, it's actually really common to just add a little section to an alto clarinet. You could even tube in the bed. Which is really practical because you can obviously get a fairly alto clarinet, but Basset Horns are few and far between, and many of them that are there, like this one, have some really weird problems with them, and it takes a while to get used to them. I think it took me like probably a year to find a mouthpiece that actually made this instrument play well. So let's see. So why don't you play your? I want to try and show off the difference between the two instruments, but I'm not sure how well it's going to come through between the mics, so I apologize if the sound quality is pretty low. LeBlanc made a metal alto clarinet with low C. They were there, but I have seen one. I've seen their Basset Horns in F to low C that they called tenor clarinets. I don't know if that's what you saw or you saw an E-flat instrument. I wouldn't be surprised if LeBlanc was doing some weird stuff in the 30s. I wouldn't be surprised if they made an alto clarinet to low C just as an experiment. I mean, they made the octocontra clarinets. But I don't know. I would have to see some evidence. If you do have some pictures or anything, feel free to send me them on Instagram. I'd love to see them. There wasn't really need for them to whole work when there was a single low C in the piece. Yes, I know. So I know a lot of literature for the Basset Horn doesn't use the low C. So an alto clarinet, as long as you transpose, works quite well. And the transposition is actually quite easy. If you already know concert pitch fingerings on your B flat clarinet, it's the same transposition for a Basset or for an alto clarinet to read Basset Horn music, so it actually works out quite well. Just another experimental clarinet by them. Yeah, LeBlanc did some really wacky stuff. It's unfortunate a lot of their instruments aren't really well documented. I mean, you don't see a lot of information about like their older like a paperclip or bass clarinets or some of those older weird instruments besides contras. Paperclip bass clarinet is a dream instrument. Yeah, I'd love to play one.
See, I want a paperclip contra so bad.
Me too.
That's my dream.
Fortunately, the price of those things have shot up like crazy. Like I should have bought one like 5 years ago when you get one for $3,000. Now it's like everybody's asking $5,000 for like a for 1 in 4 condition, just for the low C. The nearest music store I live has 2 alto clarinets. I played in one of them earlier this year, and it felt similar to a bass. Felt like a smaller bass clarinet. Yeah, I would describe it. So in when you're talking about like embouchure and finger positions, the alto clarinet is definitely closer to the bass clarinet than it is to the B flat clarinet. Obviously, it's not exactly
the same. Yeah, the embouchure. It takes a little time to get used to, honestly.
Yeah, it's kind of unique.
Bass clarinet is just like a lot more mouthpiece, but it's a mix between clarinet and bass. I will have to say, it's not that bad.
Why don't I play a high B flat and you play a high? So you play a high C.
Okay. You talking about higher?
Yeah, the high C on the clarinet. So you can kind of hear the alto clarinet has kind of a shrill, piercing sound. So let me play the same note on Basset Horn. So you can hear the sound is a lot gentler. It's the same pitch, but the color is a little bit different. It's not as shrill. It's a little bit softer. It's probably hard to hear, unfortunately, through the microphone, and I apologize for that. But there is a difference, and specifically, there's a difference in the upper register. So, for example, if I play what's a good note to play? So I'll play a low. So why don't you play a low E? So you can hear it in the lower register. There's less difference, and
better.
Sure. So you can hear the tone in the lower register is very, very similar, and that's because a smaller bore size is going to have more of an effect higher up on the instrument, and that's specifically where Mozart wrote a lot of his pieces for the Basset Horn. It's a lot of the notes, most of the music is played in the upper register, which is where the Basset Horn really excels. Yes, it does have an extended lower range, but it has a very useful upper register.
We have a question about reeds.
Is it bad to use an alto sax reed on an alto clarinet? What's the difference between an alto? Okay, yeah. So when I started alto clarinet, I tried to use alto sax reeds, and I just had no luck whatsoever. They're not really that different theoretically. The alto sax reed is a little bit wider, just by a little bit, and I think the shape is different. But I've really had no success trying to use alto sax reeds on alto clarinet. I've tried different brands, I tried different mouthpieces, but for me, dedicated alto clarinet reeds are what plays the best.
Yes, I think the same for any instrument. The reeds that are meant for that instrument are a lot better. For example, I ran out of bass clarinet reeds, but for some reason I had tenor sax reeds laying around my apartment, so I kind of grabbed those and used them instead, and it got the job done, but not like a typical bass clarinet reed would, so it does work if needed.
My dream instrument is a low C alto clarinet that has a lyre attachment. That'd be interesting for marching. I've always kind of wanted to make an alto clarinet to low C, but I've never gotten around to it. I don't know how useful it would be, but it would be a pretty interesting instrument to play. Or an E flat clarinet that can be used for marching band. You can already use an E flat clarinet. They're already loud and piercing. I bet it'd probably be better to use an E flat than it would be to use a.
I mean, a good example would be Symphony Fantastique, Berlioz. Of course, there's a piercing E flat clarinet solo, so I feel like when people think of E flat clarinet, that piece just comes to mind.
Yeah, E flat could double the piccolo in a marching band. That'd be pretty. Obviously, the piccolo has a better higher range. I use a B flat clarinet reed on my soprano sax. They're the same size. Just on my soprano sax, at least the reeds I have. What do I have? I have like Lavaz reeds because they were cheap, and they're way wider than clarinet reeds that I normally use. So I tried to use a clarinet reed on a soprano sax, and I couldn't get it to quite line up right without creating a little tiny air leak. E flat basset, alto, bass clarinet, contralto, oboe. That'd be cool. If someone made paperclip alto clarinets, I'd love to play one. Yeah, that'd be kind of I guess the idea with paperclip instruments is that obviously the key work, the instrument itself is more compact, but the key work. So for example, like the touch piece, the C touch piece, the key's only down here. The pad cup for this touch piece is only down here, but with a paperclip instrument, the touch piece and the pad cup can be closer together because the instrument is bent back on itself. So it's very practical for larger instruments. I wonder how that would work for a alto clarinet. That might be interesting to see. Maybe some crazy person will make it. I mean, Burial's card for 5 E flat clarinets.
Yeah, I read I was trying to find the score that I sent you. It was just he just uses the weirdest.
Did you use disgusting Ricos? No, I
Oh,
tried.
got it.
I tried Ricos. I tried Van Doren alto sax reeds. I couldn't get them to work. My current reed is an alto. I use a Van Doren 3 alto clarinet reed, and that seems to work well for my mouthpiece. E-flat clarinet can help out smaller bands in the high end because we don't have a piccolo player, but I also have to play bari just to cover our tuba player. Yeah, I mean, E-flat clarinet is an instrument that needs to be played all the time, but in certain pieces, it definitely has a great. It's great for effect. It has E-flat especially has not just the higher register, but even the lower register. The E-flat is a very unique tone color, and it can be used really well to some effect. Yeah, imagine if there was a paperclip E-flat clarinet, it would be tiny. That would be weird. It'd probably be like one of those curved soprano saxophones.
So I found what I was looking for Brett's comment about the use of 5 E-flat clarinets. So I love Symphony Fantastique. I'm always going to talk about this piece. But when I studied the score, I just thought it was so interesting that he decided to use an E-flat and a C clarinet, but also 4 bassoons and 2 orphicrides. And I'm so sorry, I cannot pronounce today. But I don't know. I mean, it could have been common back then, but he's interesting.
All right. It would be 6 inches. Yeah, yeah. I would imagine something like a, not like a saxonet, but yeah, kind of like a saxonet. It'd be tiny. If you've ever played a saxonet, they're kind of like awkward to hold. They're very weird instruments. Kind of.
Yeah.
It was one I made. It wasn't very good. Yeah. The alto, how would it be bulky? Wait, so are you talking about like the contra instruments or the lower? So I guess I probably didn't make my point very clear. But what I'm trying to say is it wouldn't be as necessary to make like a paperclip instrument because the keys only need to be so long on an alto clarinet. I think that's a better. This is an alto.
Yes, like.
So like the keys only need to be so long on an alto clarinet that a paperclip instrument wouldn't be practical, but it would be interesting to see. It's like because you would probably run into the situation where if you were to bend back the body, the keys would actually be longer on the paperclip version than they would be on the normal version, and it would add complexity. So from a practical point of view, it would be pointless, but from an interesting instrument point of view, I would play one. I would see it. I would love to see it. I just love being that one player that takes whatever instrument that needs to be played. It's quite fun and you learn a lot.
That's me.
Yeah, that was me in high school when I switched from alto sax to alto clarinet, which was the instrument I learned to play clarinet on, which is quite unusual, but it was a fun experience playing alto clarinet. Especially in like a high school setting where we really didn't have a big section of clarinets. I think we had 2 clarinets. I had 2 clarinets in my high school. And then, yeah, 2 clarinets and 1 alto clarinet. That was our clarinet section in high school. So that was interesting.
3 at that point.
Yeah. What do you think of the LeBlanc student alto clarinet? So I talked about this a little bit earlier in the stream. So I think the LeBlanc student alto has kind of a design problem with the register vent, where the only real problem with it is just it's too small. It doesn't create a clean sound in the upper register. In fact, if you were to just drill it out, I've done this before to some Beatos. If you were to just drill it out and put a properly sized register tube in it, it makes the instrument a lot better. But of course, that's not something a lot of people want to do to their instruments. So like the thought of somebody drilling their own instrument just kind of makes people cringe. So unfortunately, a lot of the LeBlanc alto clarinets out there are just kind of terrible instruments. So opinion on a rosewood versus grenadilla. I'm asking because I'm looking at a rosewood oboe or E-flat clarinet. So I actually just got rid of my rosewood contra alto clarinet, and I will say, as far as longevity is concerned, rosewood is a pretty terrible wood to use. It's very beautiful. It's a very pretty wood, but unfortunately, it.
You have a rosewood recorder right there too.
Oh, yeah, I'm getting rid of that too.
You want my recorder? Reach out.
The problem with rosewood is that it tends to chip when you cut it into small. For example, like the edges of tone holes on a rosewood instrument tend to chip fairly easily. So unless it has like a line bore and it has complete tone hole inserts throughout, it's not a great instrument as far as longevity is concerned. Plus, rosewood expands and contracts a lot more than grenadilla would. So again, it creates the problems with keys binding, and just it creates an overall more unreliable instrument than grenadilla. So unless you have the money to be going to the repair shop all the time or you fix your own instruments, I would probably not recommend a rosewood instrument. Yeah, especially a curved sopranino. I've always wanted to try one of those curved sopranino saxophones. They look really awkward to hold, but they just look so funny. New LeBlanc clarinets aren't that good, I feel like. Yeah, unfortunately, after the fire in 2003, when they kind of moved over to making all their instruments only, I guess they're two separate companies, so there's LeBlanc Paris and LeBlanc USA. So LeBlanc Paris is pretty much gone at this point. LeBlanc USA, they're really only making student instruments. The last one I tried was a LeBlanc Serenade, and it was being really hyped up on forums, Instagram, and stuff. So I was really excited to try it. When I tried it, I actually thought it was a terrible instrument. It was stuffy. It was in tune somewhat, but it just wasn't a great clarinet. And unfortunately, just LeBlanc lost their magic. And unfortunately, I don't think there'll ever be anything as good as the Opus. It would be cool for us for looks. Yeah. One of my pair decks just got a curved Nino. So is that the who makes that? Is that the does Orsi make that? I know there's two companies that made them. There is Orsi and there's a there was somebody else that made like called miniature saxophone. It was kind of like simplified keyboard sopranino, sopranino. I'm sorry, with simplified keyboard. I don't know. They're more instruments for showing off than anything else. But there's a lot of weird, cool saxophones. Yeah, Orsi. Yeah, I've always wanted to try one of those just for shits and giggles. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, like going back to the Basset Horn. So again, there's a lot of less decent LeBlanc they made was this. Yeah, the Bliss was an okay instrument, and the nice thing about the Bliss is you can purchase a lot of cheaper secondhand models now that they're well, no, I don't think they're discontinued. I think there's the first generation was discontinued, but they seem to sell a lot, and now you can get like secondhand models for like $300. They're a decent, I don't want to say like a used intermediate clarinet, but even that was never even close to the Opus was a great clarinet. Unfortunately, they discontinued that when they brought the Serenade, and I don't think that was as good of an instrument. Anyway, talking about the Basset Horn. So obviously these two instruments use different mouthpieces. This uses a relatively standard B-flat mouthpiece, and this uses a dedicated alto mouthpiece. However, that's not true for a lot of newer instruments. And this is where it kind of blurs the line between Basset Horn and alto clarinet. So personally, I consider a Basset Horn to be an instrument with a bore, a smaller bore. Generally, I would consider something like 16.5 millimeters to be the cutoff. So that would include like a small bore, true small bore Basset Horns, and German Basset Horns. And the larger bore instruments like the newer Buffet, the LeBlanc, I would consider to be more alto clarinets in F with a range to low C. But going back to instruments like this, so Buffet, at the time they made this instrument, actually distinguished this even further. In fact, I think LeBlanc did this as well. They, in addition to having a Basset Horn like this with a range to low C in F, they also sold a what they called an alto clarinet in F. And essentially what this was, it was exactly like this, just a radio model alto clarinet with all the features you would see on this instrument, but just in the key of F. And they sold them as two distinct instruments for two distinct purposes. This would be an instrument for playing the works of Mozart or Strauss or other works that required what would you consider to be a true Basset Horn. And the F alto instrument, I'm not really sure what its purpose was, but it was not an, obviously since it lacked the lower range to low C, it was I don't know what I want to say. It's essentially a different member of the clarinet family. And they showed they can have a different tone color when, of course, because they're using a different setup and because of the different size of bore. But another thing I wanted to illustrate was so the size of the tone holes also makes a huge difference on how the instrument sounds. What's a good compare? So on this instrument, acoustically, this instrument is pretty terrible in the sense that a lot of the tone holes in this instrument are smaller than they need to be. For example, a good one is the tone hole for low G, clarion D. You can hear that. That's a really stuffy, very stuffy, airy note. And that's because the tone hole is only about, I think it's about 5/16 of an inch wide. It's very small. On a modern Burns system clarinet, that's really not what you would typically see. For example, on this alto clarinet, Where's the better one? I need to find a place to put down this instrument.
Your music stand with the instrument stand?
I do need to. The problem is I need to get like 5 stands. So on this instrument, the same tone hole is like 5/8 of an inch, so it's almost twice as big, and you can hear that low note. It's a lot clearer, and that kind of illustrates the different thought process when they were designing the alto clarinet versus the basset horn. And when I say they, I mean Buffet at the time they made these instruments, the 1950s, 1960s. So on the older, no, sorry, on the basset horn, those were copied off of instruments where the tone holes were in a location where it wasn't necessarily acoustically correct, but the tones were in a location where it was more practical. So if you look at a classical basset horn, it's an instrument with a lot of compromise. Obviously, there was a lot of cross fingerings. There was a lot of half holing you had to do to play it correctly in tune. On the instruments that were more modern, let's say instruments from the 19th century, there was obviously some improvements, but a lot of these instruments still maintain the smaller holes of these predecessors. So the idea with these, the Buffet I just showed you is actually more just a copy of older instruments from the 19th century. So it carried over a lot of these features, such as small tone holes, which gives it a more distinct sound. It wasn't until more modern instruments like the Buffet Prestige Basset Horn, where we started to see instruments with larger tone holes, which of course they play better, but it's straying further from the concept of a true basset horn and what it should be. And of course, you can make an alto clarinet sound like a basset horn by using a different mouthpiece and change the aperture. But in my opinion, a true basset horn would be an instrument with a smaller bore. All right. Okay, what do I want to talk about next about the alto clarinet? I guess we kind of
mouthpieces on.
I guess we kind of went off on a tangent on basset horns there. So let's try get back to the alto clarinet. Yeah, let's talk about mouthpieces.
You new one. So this is a professional instrument, as we all know. Well, most of us know. When you get a professional instrument, they assume at this point in your career you own a mouthpiece. So Yamaha just provides you with a basic stock mouthpiece, which I have been using, but I would like to upgrade, I believe.
So that's the weird thing about alto clarinet mouthpieces. I have not found a good production mouthpiece that I really feel is really up to the level of modern performance standards. Yes, there's the Phobes and the Grabner and the what is it? I think Ben makes an alto clarinet mouthpieces, but you can really tell that the best, like if you were to compare the best alto clarinet mouthpiece from one of these makers versus the best bass clarinet mouthpiece, I feel that the bass clarinet mouthpiece is a lot better. I've tried several like Phobes and other professional alto clarinet mouthpieces, and I never really found anything I liked. So actually, what I ended up doing was I had to reface my own. I put like a longer facing on it, so it was a lot similar to my B flat mouthpiece, and that seems to work for me. But surprisingly, I couldn't find any mouthpiece that really plays well on this instrument. So what she's using is she's using a 4C with a Rico reed, which is if you know Ricos, they're kind of reeds that are designed to be easy to play, but they don't sound as good as a good reed with a more solid heart.
Yeah, I got Fedor in 3.5s, and they were just way too strong. So I don't like Ricos or student reed people tend to think of, but it sounds pretty well on this instrument, which I'm surprised about.
Well, we have a question. How do you feel about the Artley? So I believe the Artley is it's a stencil made by Selmer Bundy. So it's the same as the Bundy instrument, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's the same for their E flat clarinet as well. And they're actually I played an Artley bass clarinet in high school, and it was a Bundy stencil if I remember correctly. But it just kind of goes to show that when you're playing an alto clarinet, you don't really have a lot of options as far as equipment, at least as much as you would with a bass clarinet. So a lot of it's like you take what you can get. I mean, it took me a long time to find I had to make my own mouthpiece essentially to make this thing play well. The only thing I could find that played well, and this was a 4C with a Rico reed, which is easy to blow, but it might not be ideal for the instrument from a professional equipment point of view. And just as far as just accessories in general for alto clarinet are lacking. Again, going back to the idea that the alto clarinet is not as popular in recent times as it was before, and as other instruments like the bass clarinet. So unfortunately, we just aren't seeing a lot of good equipment for the instrument. Fortunately, that is starting to change. As I mentioned, mouthpiece makers are starting to make better professional level mouthpieces for the instrument. So fortunately, we do have a lot more options than we did, say, 10 years ago. But we still got a long way, I feel, until we get to the same level as we have the same options as a bass clarinetist would. All right. Does anybody have any other questions about the alto clarinet or just clarinets in general?
Fall recommendations for us to attempt to play? No jazz, please. I don't know jazz. Jared might.
Actually, that's a great. So it's interesting to see that a few jazz musicians are taking up the alto clarinet. Actually, I mean, it definitely has it's got potential, as considering that it's got the same roughly the same lower range as a tenor saxophone. So it could be a pretty useful jazz instrument. I don't know if I want to play anything. Whoops. Oh, I'm gonna stop that. Yeah, for jazz, it's got a really useful tone color. I mean, obviously, I think another thing holding, actually, that brings me to another criticism of the alto clarinet that I've heard, which again goes back to the equipment, is that the alto clarinet is not as loud as a bass clarinet. And I've heard it before.
Yeah, I feel like it's about the player at that point.
Yeah, it's more about the mouthpiece and the
projection, everything,
and of course the player. Because I think that's so in high school, my band director eventually had me switch from alto to bass clarinet because he wanted me to be heard. I guess he didn't think anybody could hear me on the alto clarinet, but I think it was more just because we had such a small clarinet section in general. But and just one alto clarinet versus a band of 50, obviously it's not going to reject for him.
Also, too, I've noticed like most of the pieces I've been playing anymore, I double mainly third clarinet kind of, but like mainly the alto saxophones, and I personally feel like it tends to blend in with the altos.
It does blend in pretty well.
So it doesn't stick out like, of course, a bass clarinet would, but for sure, bass clarinet does project better overall, I will say.
That kind of brings up the point that a lot of music written for the alto clarinet from in band arrangements.
Concert band mainly.
Alto clarinet is just doubling a lot of other instruments, the tenor sax, sometimes the horns, trombones, bari sax. Yeah, so the alto clarinet kind of just ends up doubling a lot of instruments because the composers have an idea that it's an instrument that can't really project. It's not a practical instrument to have solos on, which I think is
then you could argue into the bass clarinet follows bassoon, bari sax parts, but
I have a buffet crampon even Schaefer E flat. Oh, like an E flat soprano or an E flat alto. I don't actually. That was like the alto clarinet I had before this. I had an Yvette and Schaefer alto clarinet. That thing was actually pretty decent. It was made by Mallorin. But what I did again was I just drilled out the register bends, and that actually made it play really well. But so that's and I think part of the problem is I would like to see a bigger alto clarinet section in bands.
I mean, how many alto clarinets do you think is enough, though?
I mean, think about it, because let's take let's say like our band with 15 players. So we have like 6 third clarinetists. I mean,
no, I never said they were balanced, but
from a balance perspective, let's take
I would say
2 or 3 of these third clarinetists and put them on a well, not just alto clarinet, but lower clarinets in general, and we have a much more balanced section.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, I love the stream. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Thanks. Mine toes. Well, thanks for joining us. Have a good night. And if you want to catch the rest of the stream, I'll be sure to post it later. So if you want to catch up, feel free. I have from the 50s. It's pretty good. Yeah, the Yvette and Schaefer instruments are some of them are really, really good because there's a rumor that goes around that they're essentially just rejected buffet professional instruments, which I don't think is true. The design is just too different, but they do have a lot of design characteristics of their more professional counterparts. So they can actually be pretty good instruments. Unfortunately, because they have the buffet name on them, the prices tend to be inflated a lot. So a lot of times there might not be, it might just be worth spending a little bit more just to get that buffet professional instrument than to have a Yvette, which is just so inflated just because of the buffet name. But yeah, so unfortunately, let's say we took somewhere with our clarinetist input. Let's say we had an ensemble of 2 alto clarinets, 2 bass clarinets, and a contrabass. That's a much more balanced section, as opposed to just 1 alto clarinet. Because I'm trying to think of like a.
And I'm pretty fine off by myself.
Yeah.
But other situations, I could definitely see need. Like, for example, so we're doing a Colonial song, which many of you do know. So my part does divide or divide into 2 parts, of course. But I don't know how you can play 2 notes at once. Personally, if you have any suggestions out there, send it in the message. Yeah, I don't want to do that. So there are definitely times where we need 2 people, but
and from not just from a covering all the notes perspective, from even a tone perspective. Like for example, the brass section is a lot more balanced, really, because you have your trumpets obviously in the soprano role. You have I guess you would have horns kind of take up the alto role, not perfectly, but they kind of bridge the gap between your trombones, euphoniums, and your trumpets. So that, and then of course you have the tubas for your bass. And if we saw something like that, where in like the woodwind section, where we had more alto and tenor voices.
diversity within instruments.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the places where the alto clarinet really has an opportunity to shine. Obviously, we have the saxophone section. It's pretty well. It's not very well balanced, but more it has more problems on the higher and lower end than it does in the middle, because we have the alto, the tenor, the bari. So the middle range is So we do have a soprano player actually, but there's nothing real. I mean, we do so. One instrument we're starting to see used more is the bass sax, which is
yes, we actually have a player of that, and contrabassoon is needed too in our ensemble.
Fortunately, we don't have a good contrabassoon player. So yeah, these more using like the argument with the bass sax. If we're seeing this instrument that was once obscure come back, why can't we see the same thing with the alto clarinet? Because essentially what the bass sax is doing is it's filling in the more bass contrabass role of the saxophones. But on the clarinets, we have our bass and contrabass. We have a bass clarinet. And contrabass clarinets aren't extremely common, but they're more common than contrabassoons, really. But we don't really have a good tenor voice. I'm wondering if your bass sax player is Terry. No, I don't think it is. Who is it? What's his name?
Bass.
Does
he know what group we're in?
What?
Because I feel like that's describe this band. I'm so bad at names. I've been in this group longer than Jared. I'm just so sorry.
I need to talk more.
Like, I have people come up to me and like ask us about the clarinets and everything we bring every week, like 5 different clarinets, but like we just don't learn names, and that's bad. We need to get out there more. I feel like
I think it's
because our bass saxophonist, he doubles on tenor sax, so he's like typically our tenor saxophonist.
Yeah.
So
because I think he has his own instrument.
Yeah, because he was talking to us about that in the parking lot.
Actually, our school, our university actually purchased a International Winds bass saxophone, and that's I guess that's kind of one of the advantages of instruments coming from China. Is things like the bass sax, they're purchased so they can be purchased cheaply from China. So I have a friend up there who is in a band and plays bass sax and is adding like some of the same literature you're doing.
Where does the friend play? Which group? Because I got a feeling it's gonna be this guy.
That would be funny.
I mean, I do have more like, what is this? A tank top on that says where we play. So like, it has to be this guy. Which is a small world if it is.
Yeah. Because didn't we have somebody else play bass sax in last year, but they were using the school's instrument?
Yeah, but I think that was a student.
He's in Connecticut.
Yeah, we're in Connecticut. I mean, it says University of Hartford, so I don't feel like it could be.
Possible. I don't know. Bass sax is kind of becoming popular. Maybe a lot more people are playing it.
I mean, yeah, but it's never gonna be as popular as like every clarinets you'll find out there.
That's it. If you think about it, like
oh well, that's
no,
that's about this.
Well, that's interesting. So yeah, more people are taking up the bass saxophone now that it's available. The alto clarinet has been available for a while. It's a lot smaller than a bass saxophone.
Much easier to carry.
For clarinetists looking to experiment, it's a great option, obviously. What were we talking about before this? I completely forget. Oh, we're talking about more balanced wind ensemble.
Oh yes.
Yeah, so I mean, one single bass saxophone really makes a difference to how the ensemble sounds. I forget which piece we were playing last year, but we had a bass saxophone, and it just had such a rich, low sound. It really added to the lower end.
I don't think it was that one. It was one of the bigger pieces.
Yeah, but it really adds to the lower end of the wind ensemble as a whole. I mean, the tubas, yeah, they provide a great contrabass register, but too many tubas just it kind of overpowers the band.
It's a very heavy kind of sound after a while.
You really need some lower woodwinds there to balance. We kind of started playing contrabass clarinet, which does help balance, but obviously the contrabass clarinet is.
I still say we get a contrabassoonist.
You really should. We do have a contrabassoon, but it's very, very broken.
We still have one.
Yeah, that's better than most, I guess. Yeah, unfortunately, because contrabass really doesn't have the same carrying power as bass clarinet, which goes back to the argument. Okay, let's take some of our third clarinetist and maybe have 2 contrabass clarinets, and then we're starting to get a little bit more balance. I mean, I think our ensemble has.
You really think we need 2 contrabass clarinets?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, obviously, we can't have like 2 contrabass clarinetists and then no bass clarinetists, because you kind of need that balance again. You can't just have too much on the high end and then too much on low end and not enough in the middle. Right, so if we had like more balance.
It depends. If we have 2 strong players on contrabass, like.
Yeah, I mean,
I like him.
The problem with clarinets in general is if you try to play loud, your tone starts to go away.
Yeah.
So like if you try to play really loud in contrabass, you just get like a really loud buzzing sound pretty much. And of course, your face shakes so much you can't even really read the music, which is a really interesting phenomenon that happens. Yeah, contrabass is a very interesting thing.
Especially when you're 5'2". It's very fun. We have a step stool we sit on, but we somehow managed to be seated in the middle of like the ensemble, not the middle, but like more towards like we're in the middle. Like I have trumpet players behind me; they just can't see. So
yeah, the trumpets can really we have a really trumpet heavy ensemble. We really drown out the woodwinds, unfortunately. So
there's good though. So
and talking about a more balanced ensemble, let me bring out my next alto clarinet. I don't know if you would really consider this an alto instrument. I kind of do, just because it really fits that range quite well. So this is my my G clarinet that I recently purchased from China. And
very beautiful.
Yeah, I think this is probably starting to become one of my favorite instruments to play. And this is another instrument, again, I would like to see thoughts on metal bass clarinets. Oh, that's actually a good, I always want to talk about. So I actually had a metal bass clarinet.
Yeah.
Very, very briefly. It was a Kohler. Unfortunately, it was in a pretty poor disrepair. I had to send it back. But when I played it, it sounds like a bass clarinet. Yeah, essentially, a lot of people assume that metal instruments are going to, for some reason, people think that a metal clarinet is going to sound like a saxophone. Unfortunately, people just don't have a good grasp of how acoustics
the contrabass we play on is metal.
Yeah, I mean, most contrabass clarinets out there are the older LeBlancs. There really aren't too many Rosewood Selmers out there, so most of them are LeBlancs or the Betos, but really LeBlancs are what's.
This could be a personal thing, but when I play metal instruments, I don't. I like not like the clarinets, for example. I like using plastic reeds, and that's a personal thing.
Yeah, because I use a Leger reed on our contrabass. But anyway, going back to metal bass clarinets. Yeah, it played just like a bass clarinet and it was a decent instrument. The problem, I think, is that they're expensive and they're kind of hard to find, unfortunately. So when you do see them, they go for like ridiculous prices. So from a financial perspective, it's a lot better to buy a wooden instrument because it'll actually be cheaper. But from a, I mean, if you wanted to take up a metal bass clarinet, there's no reason not to play them. Some of the older Kohlers are actually really good instruments. I think Selmer made a few metal bass clarinets, although they are very, very rare, and those are extremely expensive. Yeah, metal bass clarinets and wooden saxophones were both a little disappointing in terms of what I was expecting. Oh, so have you tried a wooden saxophone? Oh, I'm assuming you tried one of those Sawat saxophones. I forget how you pronounce them, but yeah, those things are just weird. I've always wanted to try one, but I assume with wooden key work, it can't be a great instrument. We should have more altos and bass clarinets, especially since most don't use altos, even though they should. We should have maybe 2 to 4. should have maybe 2 to 4 basses in one field. Yeah, exactly. That would be a more balanced wind on
I've
sound.
been in bands for like summer music academies and all that. One example was at I think we had 3 bass clarinetists, and it was very good. I feel for the balance to have 3.
I play ensembles with 3
Solid number, yeah.
It definitely is it provides a really good bass register.
However, I've only ever seen one alto clarinetist that time.
Yeah.
Which is
It's
interesting.
usually the one weird like band nerd
Yeah.
picking up the alto clarinet, like me, obviously.
That's how I got roped into this.
Huge band nerd. Okay.
For band beat.
I recorded my bass clarinet and then digitally pitched it up to a perfect fourth, and I reduced the volume of the high frequencies. It sounded like an alto clarinet after that. Yeah, I think a lot of the different tone colors we hear from different instruments has to do not with the lower frequencies, but with your overtones, with your upper harmonics. That's what really distinguishes the tone colors of different instruments. So I don't have first feel with them. I don't even play reeds. I just investigate because I'm curious. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, because I'm always interested in weird instruments. So every time I see something, then you're like, ooh, wooden saxophone.
Yeah,
that's all about that.
You don't think of that one as a common one.
No, I mean, I don't know if they're still for sale, but the Sawant saxophones are really weird. I'm curious how they play because I can't exactly imagine this now. Twin gaming, there's a lot of bass clarinetists. Yeah, but most of them time they're 0 to 1 to 0 alto clarinet. Well, yeah, unfortunately.
Most of the time 0 alto clarinet.
It's kind of, I guess the term I would like to use for that is like negative feedback loop. So first you have instruments that are in poor condition. That causes players who want to take up the instrument to think the instrument is a poor instrument. Composers and band directors don't think it's good, so they don't use it. Yeah. The instruments don't get used, so they sit around, and then it goes back to you bad instruments. So it's kind of a loop where we can't get out of this loop of the alto clarinet being seen as a poor instrument until we have players take up.
However, in our ensemble, our conductor actually said it's very needed, which made us feel very good about ourselves that day.
Which is good. I've had conductors who say that we don't need an alto clarinet whatsoever, and it's a terrible instrument.
Yeah, I've seen that in professional groups too. So,
like a lot of Bundys, yes, the G clarinet. This is starting to become one of my favorites. It's just such a. I'm surprised because you would think it has pretty much the same bore as a B flat and A clarinet. So you would think
a little bit.
Yeah, you would think it would be more resistant than a standard clarinet, but it's actually very free blowing.
That note.
And it just has such a, I mean, like if you think about this, so a standard orchestral clarinetist is going to have 2 clarinets. He has his B flat and A clarinet. And the idea is that the 2 different instruments have a more distinct they have a distinct sound. So composers, when they're composing for the A clarinet, they have a darker sound in mind than they would for the B flat clarinet. But the problem with that concept is most clarinetists, they're going to choose 2 instruments that play as close together as close together as possible. So, for example, most professional clarinets still have like a let's say a Buffet Tosca B flat, and then they're going to try and find a Buffet Tosca A clarinet to match that instrument. The problem is now you've got 2 instruments that sound very tonally similar. But with the G clarinet, so let's say instead of using the A clarinet, we're now using a G clarinet. So now the tone is a lot different. The tone of the G is a lot darker than the tone of the A clarinet. So there's a lot more distinction between this instrument and the B flat. And so obviously this is a discussion about alto clarinets. And I do consider this to be an alto clarinet because if you need to go back to the 1700s, instruments in the key of G with a flared bell were historically called alto clarinets, and they really do fill the role of the alto register very well. In fact, the alto clarinet in E flat as we know it is more of a tenor instrument, but that's probably another discussion.
This is a Boehm system, correct?
It is a Boehm system G clarinet.
The question is most Gs have Albert fingering systems, right?
Yeah, so, well, for a time, most of them did. I guess, yeah, still most of them do. And that's because these instruments were predominantly used in Turkey, where they were used for more ethnic and folk music, some pop music. But again, the traditional style there was instruments were traditionally played with Albert system fingering. However, a lot of instruments are now being made with Burn system keywork, mostly for Western players who want to take up the G clarinet but don't want to learn the new fingering system. So yeah, you can get these cheaper Chinese G clarinets, and after a bit of tweaking, they're actually pretty good instruments. I'm really surprised how well this thing plays. I mean, it's not perfect. There are some, for example, the wood isn't the strongest. When I was trying to remount some of the tone holes, I was getting a little bit of chips. Unfortunately, because the wood isn't very solid, but so far I haven't had too many problems with it. I did have a barrel crack on these, but I fortunately got a new one from the manufacturer, and it hasn't cracked yet. So, from an acoustic perspective, it's actually a fairly well-made instrument once you get all the tuning figured out. I think the worst thing I had to do was I had to fill in some of the tone holes on the upper joint, and now it plays very, very well in tune. And of course, as I said, it's very free blowing. It's just overall a very nice instrument. So what would be interesting to see is, so let's think about this. So like a clarinet section where we have an E flat soprano player, and then we have our B flat clarinets, clarinet 1, clarinet 2, and then maybe clarinet 3, and then
4
occasionally, and then we start to have maybe 2 G clarinets, and then 2 alto clarinets, 2 bass clarinets, and then we have our contra clarinets. So then we have a really balanced ensemble. This instrument fills in more of the alto role, and the alto clarinet can play where it really excels in the tenor register. Because as I said before, the biggest problem, in my opinion, with alto clarinets is their upper register, just because of the poor design on a lot of instruments of their register vent. So let's take advantage of the fact that a lot of instruments are optimized for the lower register. Give an instrument like this the higher register, and then this instrument can play lower register. That sounds like something right. Yeah, I mean, this is all stuff that Brett Newton.
His book.
This is all stuff that Brett Newton has said, and he's a big advocate of the G clarinet, and he makes a lot of good arguments for it. And yeah, I agree a lot with the stuff he says about the G clarinet. But yeah, I think Brett's written for the G clarinet in a lot of his music, and it really is a very practical instrument to use. But yeah, it's so then you have more balanced ensemble. Again, I think Brett Newton has a lot of videos on this. Actually, if you guys haven't seen it, I'm sure most of the people here have probably subscribed to Brett Newton. But if you haven't seen his videos, go check him out on the G clarinet. But yeah, fortunately, so these instruments, I remember that exact ensemble in my Symphony 3. Yeah. What are you laughing at?
I like his comments.
Anyway, G clarinet. Fun instrument. Okay. What do we want to talk about next in the G clarinet?
We're talking about the G clarinet now.
I see.
But we're talking about alto clarinet.
Yeah.
If we're talking about G, I'm gonna go walk away.
This is an alto clarinet. Definitely an alto voice.
Not like, okay. I'm just gonna drink my water.
And another weird thing about like instruments, like even the Chinese G clarinets, they have a lot of cool features, like the left-hand A flat, E flat, that some altos don't have. So that's kind of cool. So we're unfortunately, again, going back to the register vents, it only has 1 register vent, but it doesn't need more register vents because it's a smaller instrument, it's a smaller bore. It has fairly optimized for the upper register. Again, with the smaller bores, instruments tend to play better in the upper registers. All right, so do we have any more questions about the...
We actually missed a comment that's a bit...
Oh, we did?
Yeah, that very long one.
And Alfred reads the balanced clarinet choir. He advocates to start with 1 E flat, doubling a solo B, 2 flat, solo B flat, 2 first B flats, 3 seconds, 3 thirds, 2 basset horns, E flat alto, 4 basses, 2 contra altos, and contra bass. I mean, yeah. I mean, before we had access to the G clarinet, that's what I would consider to be a pretty balanced ensemble. Yeah. But now that we have the G clarinet, I think it does. I think it fits better in between the B flat and the alto than the basset would in that sense. Although they both kind of do the same thing fairly well. They're both smaller bore instruments. They're optimized for the upper register. So they're, again, more alto voices, where the E flat alto is more of a tenor voice. But yeah, same thing, a more balanced ensemble that the more wider palette of tone colors.
Other comments are saying how Turkish clarinetists use the G clarinet also.
Yeah, I forget. So I guess the history with that, is that the instruments that existed that were brought over to Turkey in the early what would it be, early 19th century were Muller system instruments, and it's very similar to what we consider actually, because a lot of those instruments were made in Germany that were brought over to Turkey because there really wasn't a lot of instrument manufacturers in Turkey at the time that were capable of making a modern, in that sense, at the time period, a G clarinet with modern key work for the time. So a lot of these instruments were brought over for Germany, which is why they have this the finger system that we really aren't used to, because eventually Böhm system key work was developed, and that's what became the standard throughout the world. But in Turkey, they continue to use the Albert Muller kind of system of key work. That's why G clarinets really only have that system of key work up until just recently. Okay, do we have any questions about the G clarinet or the alto clarinet?
I did like questions.
In general, yeah. Part of the question.
I actually like this whole YouTube thing. It's pretty cool. Oh.
You're planning on getting a contralto clarinet after you reduce your collection to your liking? I actually have. So yeah, I do have another one. I have a Bundy, but what I want to do with the Bundy is I want to make a new neck for it, so that it uses a bass clarinet mouthpiece a lot like the Buffet contralto clarinet.
Sorry, so that question was, can the next live stream be about the E flat clarinet?
No.
I have never touched an E flat in my life, and I refuse to play it.
Okay, so I actually did get an E flat clarinet, kind of. You'll see. I think like 2 live streams from now is going to be about that, but it's not you'll see. It's
a surprise.
Some professional jazz players prefer Alto too, I think, because easier pitch bending and embellishments than Böhm system, but it's been a long time since I read about that. Yeah, so the idea with Albert system, and this is, excuse me, it tends to be why a lot of Turkish players prefer Albert system, is the idea is that because you have open holes, you can do a lot of extended techniques better than you could on a Böhm system clarinet. For example, like a glissando, a slide, it's kind of hard to do with keys, but if you have open holes, it's a lot easier. And that tends to be why most people would stick with Albert system, because you have more open holes. Okay, do we have any more questions that I missed? I think I missed some stuff. And I think it's kind of hard to find information about why the G clarinet in particular was taken up in Turkey, but I guess the idea was that people generally prefer the lower tones.
For the musical style.
Yeah. It was generally preferred that they like the register that the G instruments were in. And a lot of those instruments, I guess, were what they would consider at the time to be a clarinet d'amores.
Yep.
Although I don't think many of them had flared bells. So those clarinet d'amores were more flared bells. They had flared bells, but they still had the smaller bore of the historical clarinet d'amore, which is like clarinets you see used in Turkey. And of course, the modern instruments that are available tend to have smaller bores, as opposed to having their own dedicated bore and mouthpiece, which would be acoustically ideal. Because where's my mouthpiece for Basset Horn? Because I actually found on my Basset Horn that when I try to use a standard B flat mouthpiece, it doesn't work too well. I get some weird. It doesn't play. It's very resistant and stuffy. I don't know if you can see this, but like so this is the mouthpiece I normally use on B flat, and this is my Basset Horn mouthpiece, and you can kind of see that the Basset Horn mouthpiece has a bigger bore, and it has a bigger chamber a bit, but unfortunately it's kind of hard to see. And so ideally, you would think that the G clarinet should have a mouthpiece with a bigger bore and chamber to help make it play, but the smaller bore kind of gives it a distinct tone. Right, what time is it? Oh, we've been talking for like an hour and a half. All right, I'm getting tired, so I think I'm gonna end this soon. So does anybody have any last minute questions about the alto clarinet?
Oh, first of all.
Okay, go ahead.
In our ensemble, I don't have music for second suite, I host. So I've been reading it off of my computer the whole time. And it is on your computer.
Oh, is it?
But I do want to play a little bit, maybe.
Oh, wait, my clarinet.
I'm going to play for you guys a little bit. Many of you know second suite. So this is the first movement in March, around H. Just so you can hear the alto clarinet a little more. I normally play this piece of bass clarinet, so don't shame me too much in the comments, please. If you do, I can take criticism, so thank you. Good try. Maybe I should stand. Just love that keys.
No, it's such a great.
Oh, it's so hot.
Oh, that's more questions. What's the best non-clarinet instrument for an alto clarinet duet with? That's a good question.
For alto clarinet to do it with?
Yeah.
Flute.
I was thinking like a. That's a tough question. Would I pick like a higher instrument, like a
Flute.
or something like lower, like a bassoon, maybe?
Let's leave that too. I mean,
Bassoon would probably blend very well.
most of duets I've seen for like higher clarinets. I mean, alto clarinet's not high; it's like clarinet and flute. So that's why I jumped to that conclusion. But again, alto clarinet is kind of not like a typical clarinet.
It doesn't blend well with a lot of instruments because it has more. It's less distinct tone. It hasn't. It's not like a piercing tone like an oboe. It's a more softer tone that blends well with a lot of other instruments. What's the? Oh wait. Do you do live streams every Saturday? I guess I'm doing them Saturday now because I don't think Friday was working for a lot of people, unfortunately. So I guess I'm probably going to try and do Saturday now. So I think I don't know what my topic's going to be for next week, but I'll figure something out.
You can request ideas for topics.
Okay, do you guys have any ideas for topics?
Except apparently E-flat clarinets in 2 weeks, so get excited. You start your fall season with a low E-flat clarinet.
Yeah. It's not. I like the lower clarinets better. All right. Well, I think we're gonna call it a night. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thank you.
Hope you all have a wonderful night.